Hello people. Today I would like to read two poems and one essay that I wrote for the Bronte Society when I was writer in residence there a couple of years ago. What made me think of it was in the last video I was talking about miniaturisation, and then I remembered that this theme crops up quite a bit in the work of the Brontes. Lots of them. Charlotte, Emily, and Patrick all created miniature. The work of art as child, inversions of power in the work of the Brontes. Why is there a strange obsession with the tiny, this belief in miniaturisation's worthiness? It is as if through endeavour, sheer excellence that encompasses a sort of beauty, detail and delicacy, the maker believes she can save her soul, wrap it up, can condense divinely, hold something back from ruin forever by ensuring it is contained in infinitely small but infinitely dense packages that retreat still further in ever greater concentration like neutron stars. Is the diminutive size itself the assurance that no harm will come to the object? Is the danger being seen, the allure that of going unseen by an all-seeing eye? Are miniature objects and versions less noticeable perhaps, and therefore less vulnerable to destruction? Or is it, that they are also charming, so charming that no one could fail to like them or want to protect them, or come closer to them? And thus the creation of the wonderful miniature plays into the Victorian idealisation of the childlike, all that is small and pure and innocent and naive, humorous and grave all at once, whether knowingly so or not. Oh, Dave is just coming. Okay. To be fair, he's easily pleased. The Simpsons, gin and tonic. Me. Or is the appeal that of those typically Victorian virtues, humility and frugality, the danger one of excess? If so, the danger could be averted by travelling in the opposite direction, by suggesting that the bigger the importance, the smaller the packet, the tinier the work, the more prodigious the talent behind it. The romantic fragment, an effect Charlotte deliberately fakes at one point, tearing the edge of a tiny page on which she has written to make it look as though the piece was part of a greater whole, or casually created, or, even better, found, has an air of otherworldly mystery or enviable carelessness, as if it has been dashed and cast off. So although the object is enchanting and perhaps beautiful, it does not appear to have been considered or carefully constructed, to be crafted at all, as upon closer inspection it will be found most certainly to have been. This gives the illusion of innocence and unconsciousness, when all the time it is hard. Sorry, I think I have to close the living room door because The Simpsons doesn't really go with this. Be back now. This gives the illusion of innocence and unconsciousness, when all the time the work of art is highly artificial and considered. Or, perhaps, the impulse to create miniature is, ironically, the impulse to construct something that at least overtly does not even seem worthy of notice, something insignificant, a perverse turning the back on that which is obviously worth attention and admiration, a love of the unassuming, the unprepossessing, the almost, but not quite, overlooked. They could save their souls, wrap them up, save them through thoroughness, through not missing a thing. Not a dot or a dash, or a word or a glance. Nothing is lost. All was embraced and accounted for. All prodigals, all errant, all lost sheep found. There is such a feeling of peace in that, such satisfaction, such cessation of anxiety. The artist has studied the object and consigned every mark and form she thinks must be documented to paper, the artist in this way being God. Reproducing an essence, wrapping it up into the smallest of small, then gathering it into something still smaller, requires a godlike, all-seeing, all-knowing control. For the smaller the world, the larger, by contrast, the maker. The smaller the creation, the more dexterous the creator. In miniature, one mark can be made to stand for many more, is an impression only, but one so wonderful that in effect it is the whole. This will stand for this. There is a ransoming going on. The artist translates the world for his viewers, his or her viewers. He or she codes and decodes content, the whole. He or she is the intermediary, the intercessor, a Christ-like figure. In fact, though, the position we adopt to study or make miniatures is the opposite of one stretched out upon a stake. We have to bend, we have to curl, adopt a reverential and defensive position, one that is simultaneously designed by our subconscious mind to protect our most internal organs. But the miniature artifact does not only implicitly require us to adopt a defensive response, it elicits a protective impulse, both impulse and response quite different from both those evoked by the artwork of great size, which entails stretching up, standing back, opening outwards. Looking at and creating miniature things, therefore, engenders a sort of comfort, a feeling that the viewer or creator is exercising caution and hence safe, while acting in a protective way towards the artwork. An interesting inversion. The artist, by paying closer than the usual attention in order to create the miniature and ensure the realization of his vision, is himself or herself protected and perhaps created. What's more, miniatures are protected precisely because of their smallness. We daren't handle them more than we can help for fear of damaging, and so fragility, rather than being a liability, becomes something powerful, something that commands and mostly gets delicate and specific treatment. The impulse to create miniatures at all comes from a sort of fear. I'm not really sure about this now. I think it does in myself, and that's why I wrote it, but I'm not sure it does in everyone. An obsessive, compulsive, detail-oriented, detail-saving, unsimplifiable psyche, rather than, say, an expansive, sweeping, spacious psyche that's happy to simplify and miss something out. The impulse to miniaturize comes from a feeling of not enough. Every blade, every stone must be accounted for and recorded. The protective response elicited by miniaturization is therefore a completion of the emotional trajectory the artist adheres to when he or she begins to create the artwork in the first place. The creator wants protection, the viewer or audience bestows it, all quite unconsciously. A miniature work elicits a different response to a large one. The feeling of wonder may be similar, but the large work will also involve a feeling in the viewer of being impressed, in the sense of being overwhelmed or intimidated. The miniature will involve a feeling of wanting to protect and preserve. The miniature elicits a desire to cherish. A warm feeling is kindled. We come closer in order to experience the miniature better. This moment is suggested in the roots of the word miniature, which lie in the late 16th century Italian miniatura, coming to us via medieval Latin from the Latin word miniare, meaning to rubricate or illuminate, which in turn came from the word minium, referring to a red lead, vermilion, which was used to mark particular words in manuscripts with the intention of drawing awareness towards them, highlighting their value and significance. We draw away in order to experience the large better. The massive work of art elicits feelings of awe, and the origin of the word awe is also instructive, deriving as it does from Old English a. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled E-G-E, which means terror or dread. Awe suggests a desire to honour, revere, and bow down before. It is overall a cold feeling. In miniature, as everyone knows, there is an immense amount of painstaking, often awkward work that wrecks the health faster than many other things. The amount of this grueling work can, to one engaged in it, feel as if they are working off a debt or a sentence. It can feel worthy or worthwhile. Morally commendable, though not necessarily pleasurable, it appeases conscience, perhaps. When looking at the very small, our minds, source of both pleasure and pain, for a precious few moments, are required to stop. We are forced to block out the superfluous and unpleasant and humdrum, as we do not do in quite the same way as when we contemplate the large, I think. When we figuratively step backwards. With the miniature, we're sucked in, down the rabbit hole, into a vortex. The movement is powerful, consuming, and involuntary. The miniature in this sense thus provides escape by means of a vertiginous alteration of temporal and spatial coordinates. Escape is always attractive, and perhaps never more so than when we are in prison-like circumstances, where sensory pleasures and expressions are greatly conscribed, as they were in the period in which the Brontes lived. There is a déjà vu going on, a doubling, a displacement in the miniature artifact. The viewer recognises the world but at one remove. This both is and is not our world. It is another. Then, quite simply, there is poverty. People who do not have unlimited resources of space, money, or time can only make small creations, often from the scraps of everyday life. Paper was at a premium when the Brontes were writing their sagas of Angria and Gondel, so they used whatever scraps they could find, resulting in tiny books. The miniature notebooks the Brontes made from scraps such as sugar bags, wrapping and wallpaper could be viewed as always being envisioned that way, as tiny works of wonder by their creators. They could also be viewed as a practical solution to the problem of scarcity. In smallness there comes a perversity, a grandeur. Look what I have done, in spite of these constraints. The limitation becomes a virtue, then a talent, and even sometimes a gift. So that was the actually quite badly organised tiny essay that forms the appendix of the poetry collection. And now I just want to read two poems and show you some pictures. The first poem is called Stickman, and it's very short, in keeping with the subject that inspired it. A very tiny sketch I found in one of Emily Bronte's manuscripts of a little man that looked like he was made of sticks. The poem goes like this. Stickman, germ of life incarnate, titchy sprite, head an egg or a zero, feet pure delight. Halo-like, from each extremity, twigs, sparks, needles of light. There he goes, see him hopping, dancing, prancing, elbows raised in arch delight. Chock full of himself, full of fun, full of mischief, his head like the sun, limbs black as night. And in that poem, I try to touch upon the extremes and the elemental character of Emily's writing, both her poetry and her novel, both of which remind me so often of Emily Dickinson's work. And then the second poem is called Small Strokes, and inspired partly by the discovery that the Brontes produced many works of miniaturisation, both the tiny books they made filled with stories of Angria and Gondel, but also the tiny miniature paintings they produced, and embroidery and sewing and a quill tea caddy, which was quite mind-boggling to witness, inspired partly by their own work, but then by what I talked about in my last video, which is a kind of compulsion I have to make miniature things, and how that compulsion sometimes sabotages real life. So the poem is called Small Strokes, and there's a little epigraph taken from a passage in which Ellen Nussey, a family friend, recounts Emily Bronte playing with tadpoles, and Ellen Nussey writes, "She," that's Emily Bronte, "fell to moralising on the big and little tadpoles, the brave and the cowardly, as she chased them about with her hand." And the poem goes like this. "And often I wonder if I'll ever get free of it. The problem, and there are many, is that there's infinite scope for the tiny to grow, for the childlike to capture attention, the imaginary to infiltrate the real. The problem is that every now and then there's the urge to dive in once more. The waters close instantly overhead, adult time going on elsewhere, until I come up again, gasping, panic-stricken, sometimes in pain that takes years to get free from, and realise how far I've drifted. How far and how hard I will have to paddle to try to get back to where I should be going. There is a high price to pay in order to remain with the small, and with each year all the harder to establish a purchase on the actual, and therefore doubly tempting to set out for the island again. Presumably there was, or is, an optimal point to break free, but either I've passed it or it's still to come, at which time it may still pass me by. I'm not sure why you were all so invested in the small scale too. It was in the air, it's true. Victorians loved the tiny, but perhaps it was more. Perhaps it was a protection against that other, oblivion and death. Small things are less obtrusive, hence less likely to be destroyed, though simultaneously fragile. In any case, the smaller the object or effect, the more virtuous it seems to have been deemed by you, and hence worthy of saving. The small was godlike, and you were gods. The bleak and uncompromising was made tolerable, malleable, and you held what was extracted, deemed most precious, in the palm of your hands. Excess, lack, fortuity, stitches, books, lace, a quilled tea caddy, darner, embroidered knots, furls of paper, miniature landscapes, portraits, doodles, diary papers, sagas penned in letters too small to be legible, letters like blades, like grass, like marks on a wall, some sort of Morse, committed to scraps that once held sugar-wrapped parcels, papered walls. It was difficult getting close enough, and not just because of the glass cases, not just because it was stupefying to think that your fingers had touched these fragile, faded forms, but because the creators of masterpieces I knew, in places by heart, had also devised, enthused, been inspired by, and toiled over such trifles. Because staggering though these Lilliputian artifacts are, they could have been created, with the exception of some of the passages about Gondel and Angria, by many, and in the age in which you lived, perhaps very many. And those other works, the ones the world knows, by each of you only. It was extraordinary, made me want to shout out that you were human, which of course I knew, but till then only as concept. It was Hetty standing there. It was Hetty standing there before the displays, realising that in the midst of this plethora of head-shaking detail, somewhere in the weight of all this industry, all this love and patience that had passed into a knot, the hairs of a brindled dog's coat, the letters of a sampler, here you were, personal, imperfect, discernible somehow, for the first time in the pencil shading that was just a little too heavy, in the uneven distance between this stitch and that, in a portrait resoundingly accomplished, yet somehow stilted, somehow dead. Here you were. Is the outpouring of greatness always prolific? Those endowed with it? Must the ferocious capacity of those endowed with it occasionally, perhaps mainly, be or misdirected? I'm not sure, only know that in the midst of the sea of small strokes, it was stirring to see your fallibility, your similarity, and then, all the more startlingly, your genius, doubly thrilling, because discerned in so humble a context, the extraordinary within the most ordinary, the infinite and the desperately finite, the small that accompanied your greatness, your impossible greatness, invisible yet present in the impossibly small. And now I just would like to show you some photographs I took of some of the work of the Brontes, and hopefully you can see. So these were holes in Charlotte's stocking that were never darned. These were the edges of Patrick Bronte's Bible. This is part of Emily's page of geometry. This is from a miniature painting, the whiskers of a dog. This is Charlotte's writing. This is the ends of the quilled paper on the tea caddy. This is Emily's writing. This is part of another miniature painting, and so is this. And while I was at the parsonage, I photographed other textures and tiny and patterns, stone walls, grass, clouds, moorland. I'd always felt a kinship with Emily and Charlotte Bronte before I actually knew that much about them, but when I found out that both of them had created miniature worlds and miniature paintings, miniature books, I felt even closer to them. And I think there is something in that. In smallness, there is greatness. As Shakespeare said, though she be but little, she is fierce, and I can't think of a better word to describe Emily Bronte. It could also be used to describe Charlotte Bronte and Emily Dickinson too. They all have a kind of fieriness, and they all focus on the small.